The lady screaming on my front porch at 6:00 and oppos. Clock on a Saturday morning definitely wasn't an oppos. T there to welcome us to the neighborhood, with a fruit basket. In fact, she was clutching her phone like a holy relic with 911 already pulled up on the screen, her face a shade of purple I didn't know human skin could actually achieve, and all of this because my wife, Sarah, had the audacity to park her 10-year-old sedan in our own driveway after a grueling double shift at the hospital. I'm standing there in my worn-out flannel bathrobe, the steam from my coffee mug hitting the freezing morning air, just staring at this woman. Her name was Beatrice, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, who was literally vibrating with enough rage to power a small city because she decided Sarah was a, quote, criminal trespasser, quote, in her own home. You know, I've worked in heavy machinery maintenance for 20 years. I've dealt with burst pipes and temperamental engines, but nothing prepares you for the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of a suburban HOA president with too much time on her hands and a clipboard that she treats like a scepter. Beatrice had been ruling this patch of North Carolina suburbia for nearly a decade, and from the moment Sarah moved in 3 months ago, it was like a target had been painted on our front door, mostly because Sarah is a trauma nurse, the kind of person who spends her nights literally holding people's lives together, and apparently, her coming home at odd hours and having a, quote, cluttered, quote, backseat full of medical texts and scrubs was an affront to Beatrice's vision of a Stepford paradise. But here's the thing about people who build their entire identity around a $180 a month HOA fee and a plastic gavel. They always eventually pick a fight with someone who knows how to read the fine print. And 20 minutes after Beatrice made that frantic 911 call, she'd be the one staring down a set of papers that would turn her perfectly manicured world upside down. Before I get to the part where the police arrived and the neighborhood turned into a circus, I need to tell you how this obsession started. Because looking back, the signs were all there from the day we pulled the moving truck into the cul-de-sac. My name is Jackson, I'm 46, and I bought this place in Oak Creek 4 years ago thinking it was the perfect quiet spot. Pristine lawns, a community pool that actually gets cleaned, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. And for a while, it was until I married Sarah. Sarah is 39. She's brilliant, she's kind, and she's the type of woman who can stay calm while a hospital room is descending into chaos. But for some reason, Beatrice Kensington saw her as a threat to the, quote, aesthetic integrity, quote, of our street. It started with a $50 fine for, quote, unauthorized long-term guest parking, quote, a week after the wedding, even though I'd already submitted the paperwork to add Sarah to the deed. And when I tried to talk to Beatrice about it, she just stood on her pristine lawn, measuring her grass with an actual ruler, and told me that, quote, Oak Creek is a curated community, Jackson, not a boarding house for transient workers, quote. Transient workers. That's what she called a registered nurse with a master's degree, because she didn't like seeing a stethoscope hanging from a rearview mirror, claiming it counted as, quote, commercial equipment, quote, which was strictly prohibited by the bylaws. I remember one afternoon, Sarah was unloading groceries, still in her blue scrubs, looking absolutely exhausted after a 12-hour shift, and Beatrice marched over like she was responding to a 5-alarm fire, her heels clicking against the pavement with this rhythmic, aggressive sound that always preceded a lecture. Quote, the HOA board is very concerned about the frequency of visitors at this address, quote. She snapped, her pen poised over her clipboard like a weapon, quote. And we've noticed you're bringing medical supplies into a residential zone, which could be a biohazard violation, quote. Sarah just stood there, holding a bag of oranges, blinking in confusion, and I could see her shoulders sagging. This woman who deals with life and death every day was being made to feel like a criminal for bringing home a bag of groceries in her work bag. I stepped out and showed Beatrice the marriage certificate, the updated deed, and the fact that Sarah lived there, but Beatrice didn't oppose. To even look at the papers, she just gave us this thin, icy smile and said, quote, rules are rules, and some people just don't oppose. T fit the culture we oppose. V cultivated here, quote, before slapping a second fine on the windshield for a, quote, non-conforming vehicle appearance, quote. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, and she whispered that maybe we should just sell the house that she didn't oppose. To want to live somewhere where she had to look over her shoulder every time she parked her car. And honestly, hearing that broke something inside me. I've spent my life fixing things that are broken, and I realized right then that the Oak Creek HOA wasn't an oppos. Tej is a neighborhood group. It was a playground for a petty tyrant, and I was an oppos. Tej gonna let her run us out of the home I'd worked so hard for. So I did what any guy who spends his days looking at technical manuals would do. I sat down with the Oak Creek covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all 64 pages of dense, soul-crushing legalese, and I started reading. My old man always used to say that if you're going to play a game against a professional, you'd better know the rule book better than they do. And man, was he right, because as I sat there with a highlighter and a pot of coffee, I started noticing things, little inconsistencies that Beatrice had clearly ignored for years because she thought she was the one who defined the law. The first thing I found was the end quote, selective enforcement end quote, clause, a beautiful little piece of legal shielding that basically says the HOA can't hammer one person for a violation while ignoring it for everyone else. And boy, did Beatrice have violations. I took a walk the next morning with a hidden tape measure and found that her backyard privacy fence was 8 inches taller than the 6-foot limit. Her end quote, award-winning end quote. Rose Garden was actually encroaching on the common area by 3 feet, and that massive composite deck she just built, there wasn't an oppos, a single permit or board approval on file for it in the community archives I managed to access through a friend on the committee. But while I was gathering my data, Beatrice was escalating her end quote, total war end quote, strategy, and it got ugly fast. Someone called Sarah an oppos, as supervisor of the hospital, and made an anonymous tip that she was end quote, misappropriating hospital supplies end quote, for an illegal home clinic. And even though the hospital knew it was nonsense, they still had to do a formal HR review that left Sarah in tears for 3 days. Then came the end quote, neighborhood watch end quote, emails, where Beatrice would send out weekly updates about end quote, suspicious activity end quote, at our address, referring to us as end quote, the occupants end quote, instead of neighbors, and she even organized a end quote, beautification committee end quote, walkthrough that conveniently spent 40 minutes staring at our front porch while we were trying to eat dinner. The final straw happened on a Thursday. Sarah walked out her car to head to a night shift and found a deep jag scratch keyed all the way down the driver's side door, and tucked under the wiper was a note on expensive, cream-colored stationery that just said, "Some people belong in apartments." I felt this cold, sharp anger settle in my chest, the kind of anger that doesn't in oppos. TL just gets very, very quiet, and I knew it was time to move from defense to offense. I called an old friend of mine, David, who's a retired forensic accountant, the kind of guy who can find a missing nickel in a haystack of spreadsheets, and I asked him to help me look into the HOA's financial disclosures, which, as a homeowner, I had a legal right to see, even if Beatrice had been making them in quote, difficult in quote, to obtain for years. When we finally got the digital copies, David spent about 6 hours in my den, surrounded by monitors and empty pizza boxes, before he started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but that in quote, I can't end oppos, to believe they were this stupid in quote, kind of laugh. End quote, Jackson, end quote. He said, pointing at a recurring line item, for end oppos, premium turf management and aesthetic maintenance, and oppos, end quote. Did you know your HOA has paid nearly $60,000 over the last 3 years to a company called Ken's Gardens LLC for and oppos, emergency landscaping and oppos, that doesn't and oppos. T seem to have actually happened? End quote. I looked at the name, Ken's Gardens, and it didn't and oppos. T take a genius to realize that in oppos, Ken's and oppos, stood for Kensington, Beatrice's last name. And a quick search of the Secretary of State's website confirmed that the registered agent for the company was her husband, Arthur. She wasn't an oppos. T just a bully. She was a thief, using our monthly dues like a personal piggy bank to fund her own lifestyle while she harassed anyone who dared to breathe the same air as her rose bushes. Every time someone complained about her or challenged a fine, a new and oppos, emergency and oppos, would crop up, a fallen branch in the woods, a phantom drainage issue, and a check for $5,000 would be cut to her husband's shell company. That brings us back to that Saturday morning, the 911 call, and the frost-covered sidewalk. Beatrice was still screaming at the top of her lungs. Sarah was standing in the doorway looking pale and shaken, and Officer Miller, A guy I'd seen around town, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pulled his cruiser up to the curb. Beatrice practically tackled him as he got out, pointing at Sarah and screeching about, in quote, unvetted residents, in quote, and in quote, criminal trespassing, in quote, and in quote, illegal commercial operations, in quote. I didn't oppose. Say a word. I just walked back inside, grabbed a heavy blue folder I'd prepared the night before, and walked back out, waiting for the officer to finish listening to her hysterics. When he finally turned to me, looking exhausted, he asked, in quote, "Sir, can you explain what an oppose is going on here?" End quote. End quote. "Officer," end quote. I said, my voice calm and steady, end quote. "This is my wife. She's on the deed. She's a trauma nurse, and this woman has been harassing her for months, but that's not why you're here. You're here because I'm filing a formal report for filing a false police report, and because I'd like you to witness the service of these documents," end quote. I handed Beatrice the first set of papers, a cease and desist for harassment and a notice of a formal ethics violation. But then I handed the officer the second set, which was a summary of the Kinsgardens LLC payments, the lack of competitive bidding, and the conflict of interest violations that crossed the line from, end quote, petty HOA drama, end quote, into, end quote, felony embezzlement, end quote. The look on Beatrice's face as she glanced at the names on those spreadsheets was better than any movie I've ever seen. The purple drained out of her cheeks, leaving her a ghostly, sickly gray, and her hands started shaking so hard she dropped her precious clipboard onto the ice. End quote. This is private board business, end quote. She stammered, her voice suddenly small and reedy. End quote. Actually, Beatrice, end quote, I said, leaning in just a little so the neighbors who were peeking through their blinds could hear, end quote. It's a matter of public record now, and since you've been selectively enforcing rules to cover your tracks, the entire board is being served with a demand for an immediate audit and your resignation, effective, well, 20 minutes ago, end quote. The officer looked at the spreadsheets, then at Beatrice, who was now trying to hide her phone behind her back, and he just shook his head. End quote. Ma and oppose. End quote. He said to her, end quote, I suggest you go inside and call a lawyer, because if what's in this folder is even half true, the sheriff's department is going to have a lot more questions for you than I do, end quote. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. The end quote. Oak Creek Revolt, end quote. We called it, as word spread about the $60,000. It turns out, when you tell a neighborhood of middle-class families that their pool is falling apart and their dues are going up because the HOA president is funneling money to her husband's fake lawn business, people get very motivated very fast. We held an emergency meeting in my backyard, and for the first time in years, people actually talked to each other without fear of getting a fine in the mail. Beatrice tried to fight it at first. She hired a high-priced lawyer who tried to claim, end quote, administrative oversight, end quote. But once the local news got wind of the, end quote, HOA queen who stole the grass money, end quote, her defense crumbled. The board, most of whom were just well-meaning neighbors who'd been intimidated by her for years, voted unanimously to remove her, and we filed a civil suit to claw back every penny she'd taken. The most satisfying part, though, wasn't an oppose, the money or the legal victory. It was the day the moving truck pulled up to her house. Because we placed a lien on her property for the stolen funds, and because the social pressure of having the entire neighborhood stare at her in silence every time she stepped outside became too much, she and Arthur had to sell. I sat on my porch with Sarah, both of us holding mugs of coffee, and watched as Beatrice Kensington, the woman who once measured my grass with a ruler, carried a box of her fake-looking silk flowers to a van, her head down, never looking our way. As the truck pulled away, Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder and said, end quote, you know, the driveway looked a lot bigger without a clipboard standing in the middle of it, end quote. We stayed in Oak Creek, and honestly, the neighborhood is different now. People actually park where they want, kids draw with chalk on the sidewalks without getting A and oppose, vandalism and oppose, notice, and Sarah doesn't oppose, have to hide her stethoscope anymore. It's funny how one person can poison a whole community just by being given a little bit of power and a title. And it makes me wonder how many other people are out there, sitting in their homes right now, terrified of a letter in their mailbox because of some petty tyrant in a golf cart. So, I've got to ask you, have you ever dealt with an HOA that felt more like a dictatorship than a neighborhood committee? Do you think Beatrice got what she deserved, or was forcing her to sell her home going too far for a dispute over some landscaping money in a parking spot? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, because if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that the best way to deal with a bully is to turn the lights on and show everyone exactly what they're hiding behind those, in quote, perfect, in quote, rose bushes. Let's talk about it below. And hey, if you've got an HOA president with a ruler, maybe it's time you took a look at the books yourself.